Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Mid-State RBERN and OCM BOCES, I would like to welcome you all to Day 4 of the 2020 Blossoming Bilinguals Virtual Symposium, which is being held from Monday, June 1st to Friday, June 5th. To those of you joining us for the first time and to those of you who are returning, thank you so much for being here with us today. We hope that all of the sessions that you have attended and will attend throughout the week will be filled with wonderful learning and meaningful connections to your work. I am your host, Colette Ferrone-Goodwin, and I am a resource specialist at the Mid-State RBERN at OCM BOCES. This symposium is dedicated to our youngest learners, our future. On April 3rd, 2017, the New York State Board of Regents approved the Emergent Multilingual Learners Language Profile Protocol, which was developed to support state-funded pre-kindergarten programs in identifying preschool children who speak other languages at home, as well as implementing best practices relative to the role of the home language for instruction and programming. In order to support this very important work, we have invited several experts in the field from all over the state to provide valuable and much needed insight with regard to supporting early literacy among English language learners with disabilities, which is the focus of our symposium. Before I introduce our presenter, I would like to just share a few pieces of information with you. This presentation is being recorded and it will be posted to the website after the symposium ends, along with links to any shared materials. So when I say website, I'm referring to the Blossoming Bilinguals Virtual Symposium website. There is a link there now, and we are beginning to populate that folder, that link with shared materials and slides and from previous presentations. And once the recordings are finalized after sometime next week, we will add those as well, so you'll be able to access them. If you have any questions for the presenter, you can either enter them in the Q&A or you can enter them in the chat. The chat is enabled. I have my colleagues Tanya Rosado-Berenger and Janira Stoker here to help assist with that. And let's see. And if you're interested in finding out more information about our presenter today or any of the presenters at the symposium, those also can be located at the Blossoming Bilinguals Virtual Symposium website. And then finally, there's been a lot of confusion with regard to CTLE credits, so I just wanted to clarify that the only way that you're able to receive CTLE credit is by registering for the session on My Learning Plan ahead of time. And then you must attend the session, and we have to verify your attendance at the session. And then finally, there is a required evaluation in My Learning Plan when you go to mark the activity complete. So once that's done, then you'll be able to access a certificate and download it for CTLE credit. I'd also like to add that if you are on Twitter, please use the hashtag BlossomingBilinguals2020. And now, I would like to introduce our presenter for today, Ms. Denise McAuliffe. Ms. McAuliffe is a fellow resource specialist at the Long Island RBERN, and we really appreciate her taking the time out of her very busy schedule to be here with us today. Please join me in welcoming her to the symposium. Denise?
Thank you, Colette.
You're welcome.
I'm going to share my screen now with you. All right, Colette, are we all good there? You can see my screen? Okay. All right, so thank you for having me with you today. Before we get started with the content of our discussion, I'd just like to share a little bit about myself, and that is that I started as a special education teacher in the New York City Department of Education, and I started to realize that most of my special ed students were also English language learners. And so I started to look for different techniques that would help me, because I knew that the developmental needs of these unique learners were very different. And so I started to look for different strategies, and I really found that a lot of my students who were being serviced with special services actually were just acquiring the language, and that they didn't actually have disabilities, to my definition of what particular disabilities were from my studies and from my experience. And so I really kind of went on this quest to make sure that we're not identifying students who are acquiring the language as students who have disabilities. And we'll kind of go through, that was my experience, and we'll kind of go through why that is such a problem, and the different misconceptions of that. So that's why I titled this presentation Considerations and Evaluation for ELLs. Okay, here we go. So as Colette had mentioned, I am a resource specialist at the Long Island RBERN. And so if you are from the Long Island region, or you have colleagues from the Long Island region and you want to share our information with them, you can do that as well. Here is the link to our website. And you can also follow us on Twitter, where we share a lot of the different events that we're hosting and that you can register for. And now that we're kind of thrown into this virtual world, even if you are not part of our Long Island region, you could participate in some of the events that we have going on virtually. We also have our own YouTube channel, so you can use this bit.ly to find your way to our YouTube channel, which has different playlists. We right now are running different sessions throughout the week. We have a tune-in Tuesday and a follow-up Friday, which includes collegial circles. And if you're not able to participate live with us, you can access those videos, recorded sessions on our YouTube channel. You can also join our Bilingual ESL listserv. Again, that is mostly happenings that are occurring on the Long Island, in the Long Island region. But if you'd like to join, you can send us an email to our listserv as well. In a moment, I'll show you a drive that I set up for today's presentation so that you can access the materials there on your own. In there, I also have an OBE-WL resource guide that OBE put together. And so it has different resources for educators, but also for parents, and then some quick and easy QR codes as well. So that document I'll show you in a moment is in the drive. So our agenda, we're going to review some data, which has kind of brought us to the realization that there's something happening where we're not understanding the difference, and our colleagues are, questioning, do our students have a language difference, or is it a disability? Is it both? And then what do I do, and how do I evaluate our ELLs? You can use the QR code. So if you wanted to take a quick screenshot now of the QR code, that will bring you to the drive, or the link here. So I'm going to just exit for a moment so that I can show you so that I can share this link with you. I'll put it in, I think you see this all happening, right? I can put it in the chat, and I'll show you what the link, what the drive looks like. So obviously yours will look a little different, but when you get to the drive, it'll say considerations and evaluations via Zoom. It'll have a copy of today's presentation, and then all of the resources that I'm going to discuss with you and share with you, that you can definitely, make a copy for your own drive, and then you can also share that with colleagues if you wish to. Just make sure that you make a copy, and you and you move it to your drive, or you can also download the documents as well and then move them to your own drive or your own files. If you start editing something here, it'll edit it for everybody. So just make sure you make that copy. But this is what it will look like, and all of the documents I'm going to discuss will be there. Let me just, where is the chat? Okay. So there is the link to the Google Drive right there. Okay, I put that in the chat. Let me go back here. Okay, so just first and foremost, we have the blueprint for ELL success, right? And the number one principle is that all teachers are teachers of English language learners and need to plan accordingly. And so that means that all teachers, all of our colleagues, all of us need to know how to support students who are acquiring a language. And sometimes that's even students who are English language learners who already have IEPs. And their needs are also very different. So because we're all expected and willing and looking forward to working with our English language learners, we have to make sure that we understand how our students are learning and how we can support their learning. So what does the data tell us? Well, this is data from 2018-19. It's the most recent data that we actually have. And if we look at the different ELL subgroups, we can see that ELLs with disabilities, so these are ELLs that are already identified with disabilities, they have an IEP, they're receiving services. In all of New York State, that makes up 22.6, so a little over 22.5% of all of our ELLs. So when we look at all of our English language learners, 22% of them are students with special needs or have been identified as a student with special needs and has an IEP. And because I work on the Long Island region, we've also aggregated that to see Nassau and Suffolk, but they're pretty tied there. But when we're looking at all of New York State, it's 22.6% of our ELLs have IEPs. This data here, this visual breaks it down a little bit more. So you can see on the left, you have a comparison of ELLs with IEPs and ELLs without IEPs. And then what we've done is we've taken that data, or I should say OBE has taken that data and looked at ELLs with IEPs that are female and male. So we can see that more of our male English language learners are identified as students with special needs as well. I like this chart here, this visual, because it compares ELLs and non-ELLs, and by comparing by disability classification, right? So we have 13 classifications, and you can see from the data that most of our ELLs are identified with speech or language impairments and learning disabilities. And there's a huge discrepancy. I think that it's a huge discrepancy because it's more than 10% here where our ELLs are being identified more with speech or language impairments than our non-ELLs, right? Whereas if you take a look at another disability classification such as, let's see, OHI, right? Other health impairment, right? There's a significance difference there where our ELLs only represent 6.5%, where our non-ELLs are 18.5%. And maybe what we'll do is kind of get everyone thinking, why might that be? Why might, when we're looking at other health impairment, why might our ELLs not be identified with an other health impairment as greatly as our non-ELLs? Just take a minute to think about that. If you want to put it in the chat there. Why do you think that our ELLs are not identified as greatly with other health impairments as non-ELLs? Colette, for some reason I can't access the Q&A. I don't know if, can you see there?
The Q&A or the chat?
The Q&A, I'm not sure where everyone is putting their responses. I do see some coming in the chat, but I saw some notifications for the Q&A. But in the chat, just to repeat the question, because some had asked, you know, when we look at this data here, we're looking at the third set of data, and it says other health impairment, and the blue bar represents ELLs. So our English language learners, 6.5 of that large 22.5% of ELLs who have disabilities have an other health impairment or identified as their disability being other health impairment. Whereas when we look at non-ELLs, almost 20% of the non-ELLs are identified with other health impairments. So I was just looking to get your insight on why you think that might be. And I have some responses here. You know, they have been lumped into disability classification of speech and language impairment or learning disability. Someone else shared that in theirs, I'm an SLP by trade. Most of the time when I ended up with a child on my caseload who was also an ELL, it was simply because the school didn't know where else, what else to do to help them. Okay. It's also harder to identify students when there is a language barrier. Also due to their language. OHI classification in the US is mostly ADHD and mental health issues. And then another participant had asked the definition for OHI. So yeah, if a student has ADD, ADHD, they would be classified with OHI, other health impairments. And really the reason why our students are not being identified with other health impairments is not because they don't have them, but it's because it usually requires a doctor's note, right, to say this student is being, or this child is being treated for ADHD, or demonstrates the behaviors of a student with ADHD or ADD. It also requires the family to express more emotion and to dig down and talk about what's actually happening with their child. And there's not necessarily a test like we have with speech and language or a learning disability that's going to show that they have this sort of a disability. So because our parents don't have the language, most of our parents don't have the language to express how their students are developing or their children are developing, that's why our students are actually under-identified as students with other health impairments. And I think it's just unique that you can see, because there's such a discrepancy there, that something must be going on, just as we see on the other side with speech or language impairment, where there's a discrepancy. Again, it's showing that it should be about the same if we're able to evaluate our students equally and with equity. I'm going to skip over this data because that's specific to Nassau and Suffolk. Here you can see the New York State ELL graduation rates, all right? And you can see it is where current ELLs are students who were identified as an ELL during the school year of their last enrollment. Then we have ever ELLs, never ELLs, and all students. And you can see how our students are kind of performing in the last 3 cohorts. But I wanted to bring up graduation rates because in a moment I'm going to show you the graduation rates of only our ELLs. So here, I want you to think about what are the possible reasons for ELLs being misidentified with disabilities. And I think we shared some of them already in the chat. This video here is Dr. Alba Ortiz, and she talks a little bit more about why students are over-identified with disabilities. Let me just see here. I think it should come up.
When you look at over-identification, you get kind of the opposite face of the problem. In this case, people think that the problem is a disability and they don't consider linguistic or cultural differences or educational opportunity as contributors to the problem. And so they make a referral too quickly. And then you get into some really difficult issues. We don't have the assessment instruments that we need to make an accurate identification of disabilities among students who speak different languages. Even when you have assessment instruments available in Spanish, they may also be culturally and linguistically irrelevant for the student that you're concerned about. So the assessment instruments, you can take almost any student and assess them with the available tools, and they'll qualify because the instruments are inappropriate. Sometimes we make the decision that general education can't serve the needs of the student, particularly because we have populations of students that really have significant learning difficulties. If you look at students with interrupted formal schooling, for example, who come here as adolescents, haven't been in school or have had inconsistent schooling, the gap is so wide that the sentiment is that if you make a special education referral, the student will be with a teacher who has specialized skills, smaller classes, materials designed to close those significant gaps. And so special education can actually become a dumping ground for students who have significant difficulties for reasons other than the presence of a disability. So overrepresentation becomes a huge issue because we haven't been able to overcome what is oftentimes negative expectations associated with a disability. So the student over time does worse because they're not getting the appropriate instruction, because we may not have special education teachers who understand how to support the language and cultural needs of the student. So even though they're in this smaller class, the gap can widen because the instruction is inappropriate. So there are a lot of factors that contribute to overrepresentation. And I think one of the big issues for students is that once we put them in, we seldom let them out. And so we identify students as having disabilities very early, and then they can spend the rest of their school career in a special education program or receiving special education services, even though they don't have a disability.
I wondered if we could just.
Okay. No. Okay. So Dr. Alba there was kind of giving us some different reasons why students are over-identified, and then also kind of what happens once they have been identified if that wasn't the appropriate identification. And I like this quote here by actually Dr. Crowley at the Leadership Project had posted this this quote, or shared this quote. The key consideration is distinguishing between a difference and a disorder is whether the child's performance differs significantly from peers with similar experiences. However, when you think about our English language learners, similar experiences go way further than just having the same, or even if you have something so similar where students have entered New York State schools on the same date, or come from the same country, or with the same native or home language. So it's really hard to find, our students come from such similar, unique experiences, that it's really hard to find similarities between peers, and then similarities, of course, between students who are native English speakers and have had similar experiences as our English language learners. This is a snapshot of the norming data that was used in the WISC, and it kind of shows the different parent levels of the students who were used in the norming sample, their race and ethnicities, and geographic region. And it doesn't represent all of our students. Doesn't represent all of the world, which is where our students come from. So our students are not accurately represented in the sample population, which means, and Dr. Alba had pointed it out, it means that if we give any of our students these assessments, even a high achieving student who is in a AP class, who's an English language learner or was an English language learner, they may qualify for services. And we rely really heavily on data and on numbers, which is something we're going to address when we talk about evaluations towards the end of the presentation. So here is just a little summary of some of the reasons why ELLs are misidentified. Also, evaluators, even though we have bilingual evaluators, they may not necessarily be fully bilingual. That native language might be in a different, their native language may be different from the language that they are certified or bilingual in. They may not understand second language acquisition. So sometimes, especially outside evaluators, may not necessarily be evaluators that are familiar with how our students learn, how our students develop a language, or even with English language learners, they may be coming from different organizations. Administrators may demand test scores, and that's something, like I said, we're going to talk about, because we do not have to. We rely overly on test scores and on numbers, but it's not something, according to the federal and state law and regulations, that we have to use to identify students with disabilities. And of course, also the tests are culturally biased. Most of these tests are designed for students or children that are native to the United States and Canada, or are native English speakers, and not necessarily students that are English language learners, and also even based on economic status. So that's why a lot of times we see even our native English speaking students who are non-immigrants, who have lower SES, may have be identified as students with disabilities, because those assessments are culturally biased. Okay. So what's wrong though with identifying an ELL with a disability if they do not have a disability? Because as Dr. Alba had pointed out in the video, if I say that the student needs more services, they need more, they need more attention from the teacher, and I put them in a smaller class, if I go from having the student in a class with 33 students to in a class with 12, well, then they certainly should be able to get their, the thinking is that they would get more attention from the teacher and more instruction that is tailored for that student, when really, we're putting a student in a situation that is not going to help them flourish. This quote here, right in the center, it says, "These consequences may include a limited and less rigorous curriculum and lowered expectations, which can lead to diminished academic and post-secondary opportunities." And again, I'm quoting Dr. Alba, who said that we let students in, we give students special services, and we seldom let them out, right? A lot of times we don't see students being declassified because they are, we're giving them what we think they need, and we don't want to take that away. And a lot of times parents and us as educators buy into the fact that the student is maybe doing a little better, or the student is in the least restrictive environment that we can give them based on the data that we have. And then we don't want to take them out. We don't want to put them back in another situation where they will regress. Anyway, that's our thinking. When really it's the consequence of being in a special program where now they may have a less rigorous curriculum and lowered expectation because this student has a disability. So I know that they have some impairments that are going to impede their learning, and now that's my expectation that I draw of the student, when really that may not be the case. And so earlier I mentioned that I wanted to take a look at the graduation rates, but then also the dropout rates by subgroups. And here you can see towards the right of your screen, the second half, we have English language learners and students with disabilities, okay? And the three different cohorts. So that's the most recent one, 2015, and that would be the graduation data from August of 2019. This data here, this representation does not show students who are ELLs and also have disabilities, but I do have that data for the 2013 cohort. So just take a look at this here. This is a 2000 cohort, English language learner dropout by subgroup. So of all of our English language learners that are dropping out, when we look at the data, you can see that nearly half of the students who are dropping out have an IEP, right? So the ELLs with an IEP, that's that red portion, is 40%. And then they also, this visual separated out SIFE with an IEP, and that's 3%. So 43% of the ELLs who are dropping out of high school have an IEP, which tell us that, that's alarming, that so many of our ELLs who have an IEP are not graduating from high school. But it's challenging, right? Most of us kind of look like this. Is it a language difference? Is it a disability? Is it both? And there's no, I'll put it this way, this is an extensive process. You're not going to leave here today and say, okay, I got this. There's this quick and easy assessment to give. I mean, we're not even looking for an assessment because, as we discussed, these assessments are not created for our students. So I'm not looking for a test. But there's no easy way to determine whether a student has a language difference or disability. Or I shouldn't say easy. There's no quick answer. It's really extensive, and you have to get to know your students. All right. Here's kind of the 4-part process that I follow. One, it's important for teachers. So as we discussed earlier, all teachers are teachers of ELLs, whether they've been trained or not, to work with English language learners. And it's important for teachers to understand the language acquisition process, okay? Because it looks very similar. And so that's the second step here, the second step in this process. Recognize the possible characteristics associated with a learning and language disability in struggling students and how they are similar to those acquiring languages or acquiring English, because we know that the characteristics can look very similar, but there are also different signs that will tell us that, this is a student who is just developing a language, and it's typical and it's normal, and this is the reason why you're seeing these behaviors. Yet if the behaviors look a different sort of way, this is typical of a student who is struggling with understanding how to formulate words and ideas and organizing their thoughts, which would be more of a language and learning disability. The third step in the process, understanding the components of language and developmental norms of native languages. So that doesn't mean that you have to be an expert on every language for every student. I mean, that's for every language in the world, I should say. But when you have a student that's on your radar, you have to take a closer look at the norms of their, the developmental norms of their native language to kind of see, is it different from, and most of them are, is it different from the developmental norms of English? Or why is it that they may be struggling with English because when I take a look at the norms of their language, I see that it's very different, or they don't have these vowel sounds in their native language. And so that's the third start of the process there. And I'll give you some tools that will be able to help you kind of take a look at or get started with learning more about the norms of native languages. And then the fourth one, recognize and respect the cultures of all students. So not saying that any of us do not respect the cultures of our students, but respecting that the cultures of our students are different than the culture of students we may have seen in the past, or other students in the classroom, or my own particular culture. And that's going to vary the way that the student responds in the classroom to instruction. All right. So number one, it is important for teachers to understand the language acquisition process. I'm going to show you a tool, and because we're meeting briefly, well, semi-briefly, just an hour today to review all of this information, I'm not going to go too far in depth, but I want to give you some tools that can get you started. So it's important for teachers to understand the language acquisition process. I use the 6 stages of second language acquisition, and it breaks it down into, as it's titled, 6 different stages. And then it gives you an idea of what a student or what an individual at that stage would be doing. So that pre-production stage, that's that silent period. The period often lasts 6 weeks or longer, depending on the individual. That's when we get, there's been so many times where I sit on an SST and the recommendation from a teacher, the referral will say, I ask the student a question and they just stare at me blankly, right? And they've been here for a month and a half and they still just stare at me blankly. And it's because they don't understand that the student is still just acquiring the language. It's also important, and I'm not going to read through all of these, it's important that when you're looking at this document and you share it with your colleagues, that you point out that the 6 stages of second language acquisition is totally separate from the New York State English language proficiency levels, right? So you wouldn't necessarily, you can't necessarily equate the two. I wouldn't say that every entering student is also in the pre-production stage or early production, because we know that students perform differently on the NYSED and NYSED slot than they sometimes do in the classroom and what you're seeing in your everyday observance. But this data would not come from an assessment. It would come from you observing and interviewing the student. So when you share this document, please make sure that you share that kind of little note as well. I'm going to show you in the shared drive. That document is here. It's the copy of stages of language acquisition. And then I also have this component document. And these actually come from Color in Colorado. It's not something that I created, but it was so perfect already for me that I did not have to make any changes. I'll zoom in a little bit. This is a great component to the definition of the stages that you can share with your colleagues and with teachers, because especially when a student is in this first stage, so the pre-production stage, the student's not talking, not writing, not doing anything, staring at me blankly. I'm already thinking there's some sort of disability, especially if they performed maybe emerging or transitioning on the NYSED slot or NYSED, excuse me. And so this gives me some ideas, some strategies, instructional strategies to work with the students. So gesturing and pointing, using visuals as much as possible, and acting out vocabulary. And this is when you would talk about using even a more visual word wall and putting some realia on there as well, not just the word and the definition. and it goes through this document goes through each of these the stages and the different strategies, instructional strategies that you can use with your students. And again, I wouldn't know the language stage unless I get to know my student, right? So it's really through observation and being familiar with the different stages. So that's kind of the first step. Before I move on to the second step, Colette, are there any questions? Because I feel like this is hard when you're really kind of just talking to yourself most of the time. But are there any questions so far about what I've shared?
Denise, this is Maria, there was one question. It was regarding, it was just a statement regarding cultural considerations to be taken into the equation. And then the second comment was regarding resources. But on the chat, there was an interesting comment from Carmen. She says, I agree that many ELLs are overclassified for services. However, in many districts, ELL students may be underclassified because people have difficulty understanding that students can be bilingual and have a disability as well, or the ELL status is being used to deny the services, the classification services.
Yeah, and thank you, Maria. That's a great point to bring up, because here on Long Island, I don't know if it's a New York State thing or kind of where it originated, if you do take a look at Part 200, the regulations, Part 200, it does say that we cannot identify students with a disability if they have a lack of instruction in reading and math, or if they are acquiring the language. And at some point, it was talked about that acquiring the language takes at least 3 years. We know it takes even longer than that. And so what districts started doing is saying, if the student's in ELL and demonstrating difficulty, we cannot touch them until they've been here for at least 3 years, right? And I'm sure that's not the same, that's not the first time that you've heard that, whether in your own experience or someone has shared that with you. And truthfully, we want to make sure that we're not over-identifying students and we're not rushing, but we also don't want to say that students who are ELLs may not have, that they cannot have a disability and we can't get them what they need. So there's definitely, there's both sides of the playing field here. And actually the video that I shared by Dr. Alba Ortiz, she had mentioned that she was, in that video, she was talking about over-identifying students, but if you were to let the YouTube keep playing, her next video is talking about under-identifying students. So you're right. But regardless, the awareness, so sharing with your colleagues, because we're all teachers of ELL, sharing with them the 6 stages of language acquisition, sharing with them what it means to be an English language learner at each proficiency level, that is going to be very powerful in our colleagues learning more about students who are acquiring a language, and kind of be able to make those decisions where they're saying, you know what, I know this is a characteristic of students acquiring a language, but that's not what this student is showing. And we get a lot of that information also from interviews with parents, because, and I'll show you a video in a few slides down the road here, where students do not only have a disability in English. If they have a disability, it's going to be across languages as well. So that's where we would have to get, more information from our parents. But you're right. It's sometimes really hard that, we want to make sure we're getting our students what they need, and not putting them in a placement or denying placement or, services for students when they really need it. And someone just asked here, can you elaborate on the connection between the stages and the language proficiency levels? Are you saying that the proficiency levels might be different for each language language modality? What I was saying is that the language acquisition, the stages for acquiring a language do not match up parallel to the English language proficiency level. So if the first stage here is pre-production, and that's the silent period, and the first stage for English language proficiency, the first level in New York State is entering, right? It doesn't mean that every entering student is in the pre-production stage, right? Just because they performed that way on the NYSED, right, or the NYSED doesn't mean that it equate right over to the language acquisition stage. So it's really where you have to, and there's no assessment to give the student to kind of determine that, their language acquisition stage. So you would really find that out by understanding the stages, what the stages look like for an individual, and then observing and getting to know your student. Right. Okay, so we'll move on here. So the second, I was kind of talking about this process of deciding whether or not my student has a language difference, is acquiring the language and it's a language difference that I'm seeing, or if it's a disability, would be recognizing possible characteristics associated with learning and language disabilities and struggling students and how they're similar to those acquiring a language. The best way to do this is to kind of look at many of these different documents that I'm sharing with you now. What I'm going to do is show you where I'm going to put all the links in the drive. I'm sorry, in the chat for you. And then I'll show you where you can find them in the drive. Right? So the first one that I shared there is actually a document that I scanned for you, or a set of documents that I scanned for you. There are 4 different documents within that one file. Okay. The second one is a chart from the U.S. Department of Education's Chapter 6, the toolkit for working with students with English language learners and evaluating English language learners for special services. And so it's part of Chapter 6. I don't believe, I'll take a look, I don't believe I put the entire Chapter 6 for you. It's something you can Google and find though. But I did put the toolkit number 2, which is the chart that I'll show you in a minute. And then the last one is a language difference checklist, and it's in Spanish. I don't have one in any of the other languages, but I'll show you how you can use it and how it can kind of be meaningful in making you know, these decisions. Here is, let's see here. I want to make sure. Oh, that's because I'm in the wrong. This is what happens when you have too many drives open at once. Okay, so here is the toolkit, tool number 2. This is Chapter 6 from the U.S. Department of Education's ELL Toolkit. And here, what I really like about this chart, let me zoom in a little bit so that you can see it. And at the same time, I know you have the, I did share the Google Drive with you, so you could be accessing it at the same time if you wanted to. I like here that it is, this chart is divided into different modalities and different skills. So you have oral comprehension and listening, and then it shows the behavior that is manifested or displayed. And then it shows, it gives an explanation on why this would be an indicator of a language difference due to second language, or, right, we know some of our students are trilingual, or even have more than 2 or 3 languages that they are becoming fluent in, but it'll be an indicator of a language difference or indicator of a possible learning disability. So for example, a student does not respond to verbal directions, right? And we were just talking about how if a student is in that pre-production stage, they're not going to respond. Even if they know what you're saying, they may not respond because they're just in that silent period and they're taking everything in, and there's so much going on, you know, around them right now. So a student who has if it's an indicator of a language difference, here we're seeing that a student lacks the understanding of the vocabulary in English, but demonstrates the understanding in the L1. So the only way for me to know if they do understand what I'm saying, so these verbal directions in their native language, would be to go back and talk with their parents. And that's why the relationship between us as the teacher and the administrators and the parents is really important. I can't find that information out from anyone else besides the parent, especially if the child is in that silent period. However, if it's an indicator of a possible learning disability, it will look more that the student is consistently demonstrating confusion when given verbal direction, so either in the language one or the native language or in English, and it may be due to the processing deficit or low cognition. So again, or this could be a native English speaker. But again, it's information that you're going to get from observing your students, talking with your student, and also with their family. So I like this document, how it's kind of broken up into the different skills and different modalities. And it's something to take a look at, so that especially if I have a student who's on my radar, I want to look and say, yes, this is the behavior that my student's demonstrating, and then look at the indicators and try to determine, based on what I know about my student, which category it falls more into. You could even use this kind of as like a checklist and highlight for a student, so you can make copies and highlight. And when you're presenting this either to the school-based support team or to your, during a CSE meeting, whatever it might be, you're presenting this data and you're saying, this is what I find based on my observations with my students. And that's data that you can use in that meeting and to make those decisions. The other documents are also in here. So this is characteristics of language difference and language disability. This is the one I was talking about. It's actually 4 different documents, so I'm not going to go over them, but it's something you can take a look at to kind of see, again, more visual. It's a chart with some different examples of the behavior, the indicator, but then is why it would look different for a student who is struggling and has a disability, or a student who is actually just continuing to acquire their language. Okay, and the last one I want to show you right now is the language difference checklist in Spanish. Just zoom in here. So again, this can kind of be used as a checklist to help identify whether or not a student is acquiring the language, continuing to acquire the English language, or is actually having some difficulties in all language. So for example, the first question here says, when the individual pronounces a word that begins with the letter V, does it sound like a B? So for example, van, so V-A-N, sounds like ban, B-A-N, B as in boy. If you were to check yes for any of these items, and there's an explanation at the bottom, if a yes or sometimes response was recorded while completing this checklist, the individual may be exhibiting speech that is indicative of an English language learner. And so you can kind of just go down to learn more about your student, and this would just be more data to say, look, this student is actually just acquiring the language. Or if you're checking sometimes or no, you can say, look, I think my student is having more difficulty in acquiring any language, and it may be more of an example of a language disability or some other disability that we want to look further into. So those items are in the drive for you. Okay. I'm not going to play the video just for an interest in time, because we kind of want to make sure we get to also, what we can do after I've gone through this process and I say, actually, I think my student does have a disability, and I want to kind of look further and say, but how am I going to evaluate them so that it's meaningful and not biased? However, this is what we were talking about earlier, where we said the problems will appear across languages, and it's really important to get the parents' insight. Ask the parents questions about, is the student having difficulty following directions at home? How do they pronounce words and convey their messages in the native language? And I also have some different documents and tools that can help you when you're interviewing parents. Of course, you're going to want to use a translator if that's what your parents prefer, if they're not, if they're native language, or if the language that they prefer to be spoken in is not English. Okay. Understand the component of language and developmental norms of native language as compared to English. Again, we're not expecting that, even myself, I'm not expecting myself to learn everything about every other language than English. But if I have a student, especially the majority of my students, or a student who's on my radar that speaks Spanish or speaks Polish, speaks Chinese. That's the language I want to take a look at right now, to kind of see, you know, what are the developmental norms there, and how is it different from English, because that may explain why the student is having so many problems, or demonstrating so much difficulty with acquiring the language. Okay, and one of the tools that I use is this Spanish. It's actually a chapter from a longer book by Bilinguistics. So chapter 13 is on Spanish. I did include, I think I did put a copy of the chapter in the drive. It's one that I'm going to ask you, though, not to put on any websites, because it is copywritten, but to kind of look at, and then if you're interested, at the bottom, you can kind of see where it comes from, the citation on the bottom of the chapter. But it's interesting to kind of go through and see, you know, how many, vowels, how many consonants, if it's even written that way, because some of our languages are written with characters and not using the alphabet that we're familiar with. It shows you examples here. So actually, I want to go to the drive and actually show you the chapter. Where is it? Here it is, Spanish chapter. Where is the one I want to show you? So you can see it kind of goes over developmental norms, which might be different than the norms for a student that is not an immigrant, or a student that is whose native language is English. And it shows also, where's the one I wanted to show you? Has different patterns here, patterns of native language influence, and different phonics examples. So learning about the language may give you some more insight to say, oh, you know what, that's why the student pronounces, these words in this particular way, or, you know, that the student is still kind of using some Spanish syllables that are not, in similar to the ones that we have in English. So learning about the language is going to be helpful. I also wanted to share this note at the end of the chapter. Zoom in a little so that you can see. A special note for vocabulary in Spanish. So the vocabulary choices of Spanish-English bilinguals acquiring the English language can provide insight about whether a student demonstrates a language difference or disorder. When the bilingual children with typical development do not have the precise word for what they want to say, so this is a student that's acquiring the language, they will often use words that are close in meaning to the target. So for example, you have turtle for frog. All right. In contrast, bilingual children with language impairment often use non-specific vocabulary. So for example, this or thing, more often than their typically developing peers. And they gave more examples at the bottom. And I thought that was really interesting, because when I look back and think about students I've had in the past, many of my students who had true language and learning disabilities, they have trouble recalling information, trouble with their receptive and retaining information and organizing their thoughts. So they would use those non-specific substitutions, whereas our students who are acquiring the language are organizing and actually categorizing the vocabulary that they do know, which shows an incredible processing ability. And even though it's not the correct term, they're trying to make meaning for that target word. And so I thought that was really unique. And right now, even in this session, you're learning a little bit about the developmental norms of Spanish that might help you with students who are on, I like to kind of say, on your radar, or may come on your radar in the future. Another tool that you can use is the analysis of most commonly spoken languages in New York State. Again, that's also in the drive. Here, it's part of a larger document, but you can see, I'll zoom in here. It's on page, I think, two or three. And it gives you the language, it gives you morphology, it gives you word order, it gives you a sample sentence. It's very brief, but it does at least get you started on taking a look at the languages that your students are speaking and how it's different from English, which might show why a student is having, I mean, I hate to say that it's difficulty, but maybe why the student is struggling, because in your eyes, you're looking at this student, they're on your radar because they're struggling, but it will give you some more information about why that is, and then it will help you also to drive your interventions or your instruction moving forward. Right. The last part of that process then, of course, is to recognize and respect the cultures of all of our students. Using the culturegrams, take a look at the culturegrams. You can subscribe to create an account for free, but then most of your public libraries, or depending on your BOCES, you might have a virtual reference collection that will give you access to the culturegrams. Learning a little bit more about the culture where your students come from, and that they that they have been either brought up in or based on places where they have lived, and to learn a little bit more about why your student might be reacting the way that they are to you in certain situations, but also ways that you can respond to your students that would be more culturally appropriate. Also, attending PTA meetings, interview with your students, and social emotional learning journals. SEL should not be something that's like, hey, everyone, come to the carpet. We're going to do an SEL lesson, or we're going to do our social emotional lesson, but it should be something that is built into your instruction, and where you can kind of gather information and get to know more about your students and how they're feeling. And some of our ELLs, it's really an amazing experience when your ELLs talk about, and sometimes they talk about how they're feeling when we least expect it. So on the NYSED, we'll be grading the writing section of the NYSED, and a student is pouring out how they're feeling and how challenging it is to learn English. Or English might even be their third or fourth language, and it's just it's a lot. It's overwhelming, especially our adolescent students, where they're learning so much content and filling in all that the deficit of the background knowledge. So it's a lot for our students. So we have to kind of get to know our students a little bit better, which will give us more information about them. It's not information that we can get from a test or that will be on, in their, the cumulative folder or something like that. So before I finish up with what's required of an evaluation, Colette, do we have any questions? Or I feel like I'm going really fast, but I also want to get like so much in. It's hard to leave some of this out, and not have a part of the, have it part of the conversation. Are there any questions or anything that we need here?
I don't know, Maria, Johnny, you might have a better.
I'm looking at the chat here.
Tanya, Johnny, anybody? There was one question. I think Dano actually answered it.
Yes, he did, and gave and put in a link towards some resources. There are some wonderful accolades for all of the research and all of the resources that you're sharing. So, but that is fascinating, great resources, etc. So a lot of relating to what you're saying. Thank you, Denise.
All right, great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it can be overwhelming for us as teachers, because as I mentioned in the beginning, I kind of give that little disclaimer as, when you leave here today, you're going to feel better equipped where I have all these tools, but it's not easy work. It's an extensive process. And I see the question about AIS. It's something, and thank you, Gaetano, for sharing that that manual that I think you shared an AIS handbook to the participants. Thank you. You want to keep in mind that when we're talking about AIS, or we're talking about interventions so that we can look at the response to interventions, right? The RTI, ELL services and bilingual programs, that's part of Tier 1. And so we want to remember that that's part of the general ed classroom. Like that's part of Tier 1. And so when we're giving our students additional services, that's when it would also, it would also be in the general classroom. So differentiation, all of that is part of Tier 1. And then when we say the students need a little bit more, which could be more if you have the staffing, and the time built into the student schedule. It could be more standalone E&L classes if that's something you think the student needs. And I know a lot of programs on Long Island, they're starting more like newcomer programs so that students who are SIFE and are newcomers can get even more than the mandated minutes as part of their E&L program. And that would actually be an intervention that's more of a tier 2 intervention. So yeah, and it's something you also have to talk to your department administrators about. So I'll finish up this last section here is, so if I go through this extensive process and I find that my student is struggling, not because of the language, because they're struggling in their native language and in English, and we want to evaluate the student to see what other services are available for our student, what can I do? Because as we discussed, giving them, using the WISC or the WIAT or, the preschool assessments, that's not going to yield the results that we want. That's going to show that any one of our students has a disability. And we want to make sure that we have data that is most appropriate for making the most appropriate decisions for our students. Okay. So what does the federal law say, right? All students are required or are entitled to an evaluation with evaluation materials that are free from cultural and racial biases, okay? Also under IDEA 2004, all students are entitled to an evaluation with evaluation materials that are able to distinguish a disability from a lack of adequate instruction in reading and math, and also limited English proficiency, right? So we want to make sure that we're not taking our students, that's really what we've been talking about the whole time. We want to make sure that we're not recommending that students or saying that students have a disability just because they have limited English proficiency or they're developing their English, right? So what does a typical evaluation look like? These are actual real examples from students that I've had. So we have 3 different profiles here. And I've kind of color coded them. So the blue are those standardized assessments. Most of them we should be really familiar with. The red are dynamic assessments. So these are assessments that don't have a number associated to them, but are more clinical evaluations and interviews and teacher reports, clinical judgment, all right? And they're more of those non-biased assessments. And then the green, what that is. The green is actually the acculturation quick screen. I'm not going to get too much into it. I think I did put it in our shared drive. It's a set of questions that you can go over with your student, and it tells you how could I word it? How the student is, how quick the student is acculturating to the culture, the English culture in the United States and in Canada. And so you would only use it in the US and in Canada, but it'll show you that, this is a student that is brand new to the culture, or this is a student that has actually acquired the US culture, which can help you with making decisions about, how the student is kind of, how, when you're looking, I'm trying to think of the terms that I want to put this into. It's getting late. When you're looking at your student, how they are, how representative they are of the norms, the sample population of students for some of these assessments. So if they're, very early in acquiring or acculturating to U.S. customs and culture, then we know that they're not going to be represented in that norm sample. And so it's just more data that you can use to talk about your student in an evaluation. How appropriate are standardized test scores in evaluating ELLs? Well, I think we kind of know the answer to that. This field advisory, it is the most recent, but it is, but I realize it's from 2014. You have the link there, and you also have a copy of it in the drive. But what it says is that ELLs, and this is screenshots directly from that that memo, ELLs are significantly over-identified as students with speech and language impairments, learning disabilities, and emotional disabilities as compared to non-ELLs. It also states that it's inappropriate to use standard scores from tests that fail to assess an ELL based upon norms reflective of the student's culture and linguistic background. Okay, so it's saying here that we must take into consideration the assessments that we're using, and it is acknowledging that these standardized test scores are not going to really give us the results that we're looking for, or valid results that we're looking for. All right. At the bottom, it says, when interpreting evaluation results, care must be taken that issues of language difference are not confused with language disorder, and that patterns of performance related to the student's sociocultural background or interrupted schooling are not mistaken for signs of a disability. Okay, and this is why it's really meaningful for us when CR Part 154 was revised. You know, it stated that an ELL or bilingual teacher must be on the included as a mandated member of the CSE meetings. So if the initial evaluations, triannual, annual reviews, there must be someone there that is familiar with language acquisition, and best case scenario, they would be familiar with the student. Sometimes with scheduling, it doesn't work out that way. I might be at a CSE meeting for one of my my colleagues' students, but we're there because we understand the difference between acquiring a language and a language disorder. And so we're there to kind of share that information to say, you know what, the data that you're seeing here is going to be, you know, is based on data that's not evaluated my student properly, and to take a look at other parts of the data. We also see in the manual, so in these standardized test manual, it does talk about, you know, students that the normative sample would not be appropriate for. We also have to use clinical judgment. So, you know, it's we have to kind of take a look at the different assessments that our students are given, and then say, well, let's just make sure we remember that this assessment is not normed for this particular, the culture of this particular student. These are other, and I won't read them all, but you can kind of look at it later on. These are all disclaimers in assessments and in IEPs. So that would be the clinical judgment that says that, you know, this is the test score, but it should not be reported for a student who the sample is not representative for, or used to make any decisions for these students. What does need to be in evaluation? The Committee on Special Education and other qualified individuals must draw upon information from a variety of sources, including aptitude and achievement tests, parent input, and teacher recommendations. So achievement tests, the achievement tests that we usually use are the standardized assessments, but it does not have to be those standardized tests, all right? We kind of are stuck on using a number, and this may shake up your typical CSE when you talk about the fact that we're going to ignore the student's IQ score or ignore the assessment data that we're getting, the numbers that we're getting from these assessments. But the regulations, this comes right from New York State CR Part 200, says we do not have, we need to use all of these sources, not just these achievement, these test scores. So I know we're running a little short on time, but you can see and you can access this presentation on your own to do a little bit more insight. I give you some more examples of alternatives to standardized tests. So different dynamic assessments, language samples. We talked about interviews with parents and other teachers and with students, and observations at different settings. It's incredible how different students act in not only saying, I think we know they act different in the gym than they do in the ELA class, but just looking at even the ELA class and the social studies class, or ELA and science, or math and science. You know, students, they have different experiences in different settings, and so it's really powerful to take a look and observe students in different ways. Also narratives are a great example of a dynamic assessment, and so you can use your data from a narrative to talk about how the student was able to maintain a storyline. The student was able to use vocabulary or was not. So different narratives. SLAM cards, that's also something, it's a free resource. And I've linked all of these, resources in, if they're not in the drive, then they're linked here in the presentation. So using these non-biased SLAM cards where students, you know, they talk about their own experiences. So this is an example of the Bunny Preschool and Elementary Language elicitation cards. And you would give the student, where there's not, you would give the student these pictures, and they talk about, you know, they come up with kind of this narrative of what's going on, but there's not one right or wrong answer. You're just using the data to talk about what the student can and is having challenges with. This is another one too, the language sample for representative language sample for preschoolers and elementary students, and it pulls on all of these skills, the receptive, expressive, pragmatic, and communication functions. I do have this item also in the drive for you. Here's some questions that you can ask during a parent interview, whether it's in English, or if the parent's preferred language of communication is not English, then it's important that you have a translator with you as well. And there's some other ELL intervention checklist, because I'm gathering information before I go to the CSE, before I go and talk about the data. So this would be all the data that I'm collecting. It could also be data that you're collecting during interventions, so tier 2 and 3 interventions, and then bringing that data to the CSE if it comes to that. So the takeaways here: language differences are different from language disabilities. Patterns of performance related to sociocultural background and interrupted schooling are not to be mistaken for a sign of disability. Assessment materials and procedures used to assess an ELL must be selected and administered to ensure they measure the extent to which the student has a disability and not the English language skills. Assessments and other evaluation materials used to assess a student must be provided and administered in the student's native language. And there is that little side note of, you know, to the best extent possible. And that's sometimes why our students who are ELLs have a delayed initial evaluation, because we're waiting for that bilingual evaluation. The second to last bullet there: standardized assessments are not always reliable. And as I showed you from the different regulations, federal and state, they're also not mandatory. So standardized assessments do not have to be used for identifying whether a student is eligible or not eligible for special services. And then finally, the Committee on Special Education must include at least one individual who is knowledgeable about the student's English and home language development needs. So that would be the ENL or the ESOL teacher or the bilingual teacher. Best case scenario, it would be you know, that you're familiar with that particular student, but sometimes, like I said, it doesn't happen that way, and you're there for one of your colleagues' students. But it is mandatory that if it's an English language learner, that you have someone that is familiar with language development. And then this is kind of just the end here, right? We know being an ELL is not a disability, being bilingual is an asset, and appropriate services and services and assessments are key. So I will kind of stop sharing there, and I'll take a look. I know I went a little quick at the end, but if you have any questions, I'm still available, so I could answer any of the questions that any of our participants have. Colette or Yanni, did you see anything that you want me to respond to, or?
Yeah, it's more a comment and sharing of a story of Pat, who's sharing that she never had a true L1. And then she shares the story of a student that she had that went back to Korea to be with grandparents for a few years as a preschooler. While he can speak Korean, he doesn't have any other language structure in his native language. While others know the structure in their native languages and can make linguistic connections, he cannot.
Yeah, and that's challenging when students don't have, you know, I'm trying to think of examples of students that I've had in the past where, you know, the student was never really proficient in either language. I had a student who was a student with a disability, was receiving services, you know, and the student, based on what the student can do and the characteristics of developing a language and a language disability, the student had a language disability and other cognitive disabilities, but the student never was really proficient in their native language, which was Hindi or in English, which makes it even more challenging when you were talking about instruction, because you know, most of our students can use what they know about the rules of a language from their native language to help them in learning English. So it is really challenging, and that's when our special ed peers and colleagues, it's important to work together to kind of help the student as well, because essentially they're doing both. They're learning the language, but it's their disability that's impeding their ability to learn the language. But we knew that it was in both languages, not just in English.
So Denise, the follow-up question from Pat would be, does it help to have language writing samples in the native language?
It only helps if you are going to have someone that can interpret it for you. So I know that when students would come through in my most recent class situation, I was working in a middle school where most of my students were from Asia, and they were from Pakistan and Bengali and and India, and they they would write in Punjabi and Hindi, and those weren't languages that I was able to translate the physical language, the writing samples. So for me, it wasn't something that was useful in making those decisions. But again, I'm talking about more of that initial interview process and identification process. But I think if you can, as much data as you can gather on a student, it's going to be helpful as long as you can interpret it. So if you have someone that can help you, and maybe it's the parent, maybe the parent can speak English and tell you what the student has written in their native language. Because if they can understand, the grammar, and they can understand sentence structure and discourse in their native language, then they certainly can do it in English, and it's not that they have a disability. That would be more indicative of them acquiring the language.
All right, do we have any other questions?
Doesn't seem that we have any more questions, but we had lots of comments of gratitude and appreciating of the resources shared.
Yes, thank you so much, Denise.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Great
And
information.
also, it is a lot of information. It's an extensive process. And I would encourage you to make copies of the documents that are in the shared drive. I never really take anything out of a drive, but you never know. One day Google might, I doubt it, but disappear or whatever it might be. So if there's something that you really like there, just make sure you make that copy or you download it for yourself.
There is a comment from Svetlana, a reminder that Dr. Crowley's website has free materials in multiple languages and has recorded modules, and that it's an excellent website as well.
Looks like we had a couple participants who raised their hand. Kelly, do you want me to, I can unmute you if you like. No? Okay. All right. Maybe somebody pushed it by accident? Okay. How about Shamamai? Okay, I guess not. Okay. All right. So
Just many thank yous.
Yeah, so let's wrap up because it is 4:18. I just want to thank Denise again for presenting and for being here, for sharing all of her expertise. Wow, what a lot of excellent resources. Thank you so much. I also want to thank our participants, all of you, for joining us today. Thank you so much, and thank you for everything that you do to support our most precious commodity, which is our children. Also want to shout out to all of the RBERN networks across the state, including my peeps at Mid-State RBERN and OCM BOCES Marketing Department, OCM BOCES Instructional Support Services, and professional and community-based networks, including New York State TESOL and the Mid-State Regional Partnership Center. Without all of this collaboration and support, this would not have been possible. So I just want to say a huge thank you. Hope to see you at other sessions. We've got one more day left after today, 3 more sessions. They're really excellent sessions as well. Hope to see you tomorrow, and enjoy the rest of your night. Thank you again.